This is a children's story written and read by Susie Kennedy. And this story is called A Springtime Story. Every day the sun shone for longer and it was a little bit warmer. On their way to school, Louise would stop to look at the flowers that grew around a large tree set back a little way from the road. Just after the Christmas holiday there were snowdrops, tiny little white flowers with bright green frills on their petals. After that came some purple and yellow crocus flowers. These also grew in clumps around her favourite tree. And now daffodils were coming up, not in bloom as yet. If anyone tried to stop her looking at her tree on the way to school, Louise would get very upset, and that would affect her all morning. The reason for this different behaviour was that Louise had been diagnosed as autistic. She'd been visited by different people at school and watched as she learnt and played. Louise hated the playground and she hated the school assembly, unless it was quiet, which was very rare. She would sit at the very back of the hall with her hands over her ears, looking very uncomfortable, lost in a world of her own. So now she didn't have to go to the assembly, and in playtime she went to the library and read a book. She was a very good reader, and once she started to read a book, she would keep reading it at every spare moment until she reached the end. Louise was a lovely-looking girl with fair hair, perhaps a touch of red about it, and with clear blue eyes. You'd not be able to pick her out from a crowd unless it was noisy, and then she would be the girl with her hands over her ears and her eyes screwed up shut. Louise was not very good at ball games or skipping games. She never played tennis or football. But she was very good at walking over rough ground out of doors, which she did with a group that she met with at the weekend. The group was run by a couple who were both very experienced in hill walking and had been members of the mountain rescue team for years. But now, every weekend, they gathered together a group of young people who were different, bright and clever, but had what some people called issues. Louise had a pair of special walking boots, special to her, and these had elastic laces that only needed pulling tight, and they would simply stay in place. Louise lived in Scotland, close to Loch Lomond, and within easy reach of the hills around Ben Lomond, and she went to school in Balloch. She walked to the school every day with her mum, and occasionally, if her dad was off work that day, with him. She was tuned into nature, the flowers, the trees, and the animals that lived in the wider area. Everyone was happy to see the spring, but it seemed to make a far deeper mark on Louise. At school, she had a support worker who helped her with the lessons, and if it got very noisy in class, then they would move to the library, taking their school books, pens and paper with them, and carry on the lessons in the quiet. Learning was difficult. Writing was difficult, as her mind knew what she wanted to say or put down on paper, but her hands never seemed to connect correctly with the pen and paper. Sometimes things would end up back to front. Louise had a wonderful imagination and came up with some very interesting stories of who she had met and spoken to on her walks. She had met both Mr. and Mrs. Fox. She had sat very still, eating her packed lunch, when Mrs. Fox came and sat close, and so she'd shared her sandwiches with them. She would tell her support lady who she'd seen and who she'd spoken to. It would be so much better if the school or someone gave her a recording gadget, something that she could tell all the stories to, and then someone else would type them up. But that was not possible. The school had no special measures for children like Louise, those who were autistic and dyslexic. But maybe there was someone who could help. When she was older, Louise was going to have to travel by taxi to a school that had a special unit for autistic young people. There they would understand her problems better. They would be able to help her learn and grow. But that was for the future. Now was the time to look forward to the spring and then the summer. One day, on her morning with the hill walking group, she met Mr. Fox again, and this time he kept following her all the way home, and then he disappeared, and later that day, just after dark, he came back into the back garden. Louise insisted they gave him something to eat, and managed to get the leftover meat joint, a piece of lamb still on the bone. Louise went outside and offered the meat to the fox, but he was very scared about coming too close, and so she put the meat on the ground and stepped back. Mr. Fox snatched the present, ran off with it, and all went quiet again. Over the next few weeks, every 3 days or so, he would appear again and sit down and wait for a food gift. And then one evening he came with Mrs. Fox, and she was looking very well. She was plump, and her coat was looking in very good condition. Again, Louise brought some meat scraps and an apple out into the back garden, and Mr. Fox picked it up and took it over to Mrs. Fox and put it down by her feet. He was feeding his partner, and all this time Louise and her family had just thought he was a greedy little fox. Suddenly a car backfired outside the front of the house, and the 2 foxes ran for cover underneath the garden shed. They crept out and picked up the food that they had dropped and took that under the shed, and there they stayed, not wanting to go anywhere else. Louise's mum took a bowl of water and left it outside the front of the shed. If they were thirsty, then at least they would have a clean drink. Clearly they had taken up residence. In the morning there was the earth that had been scraped out from under the shed, and the female fox had made herself a den. She'd pulled some of her fur out from her tummy and lined the bed with it. Louise was full of the story when she went to school the next day, but no one actually thought the story was real. They thought she'd made it up, as she did have a very vivid imagination. It was around the time of the spring equinox that Louise went out into the garden with some scraps of meal for the fox couple and heard strange little noises. She crept closer and then saw what was making the noise. Mrs. Fox had given birth in the night, and there was a wriggling mass of odd little things that looked like tiny puppies, all with their eyes shut. This time Louise got her dad to come out and take a photo, and then print it out for her to take to school. And when time came in school to share stories or happenings, she produced the photo and told them all about the Fox family. "I did keep telling you," she said, "but no one up till now had taken any notice, but things were different now." Louise and her Fox family were almost stars at school. From that moment on, people started to look again at Louise, look past the label of autism, and to her as a person with funny quirks, and soon she was mixing much more with the other children, and they were listening to her and treating her as one of the gang, just a little different.